Thank you everybody for joining us today on our education session. This is a community of practice for ethics and governance officers, and we're a national group. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today. On behalf of the Wulgurukaba and Bindal peoples where I am today, and the many lands across Australia where you are, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. For those of you who are new, our community of practice is organised by representatives from each state who are ethics and/or governance professionals, and our community aims to connect people across the sector to share ideas, knowledge and resources related to human research ethics committees and also research governance.
Hello everyone, I'm Michelle and I'm actually up in Darwin, so on Larrakia land, and I'd like to introduce our amazing speakers that we've have been generous enough to give us their time today. So first of all, we have Jeremy Kenner, and Jeremy is an expert advisor for ethics to the National Health and Medical Research Council's Research Quality and Advice Branch. At NHMRC, he is responsible for or contributes to a broad range of programs and projects related to health and research ethics, governance of research, and the clinical trials ecosystem, and provides advice within government and externally on these matters. And then we have the amazing Sonia. Sonia is the HREC Chair for Metro South Hospital and Health Services in Queensland. Sonia has over 25 years experience in research administration with a strong focus on enabling ethical research conduct within and in collaboration with a large metropolitan health service. She has extensive experience in advanced research ethics and integrity, research governance management, and strategic research advisory services. With a continuous improvement mindset and servant leadership style. So they're our amazing two speakers today. So we do have a Q&A section that Jeremy and Sonia will attempt to address as many questions as possible during the session. And we'd like you to add your questions to the Q&A section or tab and not the chat tab. The chat tab will be just for people to engage with each other. So I'd like to hand over to Jeremy and Sonia and look forward to hearing their presentations. So thank you, Jeremy and Sonia.
Sorry, I had a technical complication. Hello to everybody, all 233 participants that we currently have online. I'll start with an apology because some of you may have heard some or most of this talk before, as I do present on a semi-regular basis. So you can go grab your cup of tea if you like for the first bit. As you know, we have a very limited time, so I will speak quickly. I will gloss over some things, and I'll also make a comment a little bit later about some restrictions that I'm under for this this event. So as you know, we are about to make effective a document that was released on the 1st of April, the 2025 National Statement. And I'll even have a comment about that at the end of the presentation. So let's get going. I will skip the introductory slides mostly because if you don't know what the national statement is by now, I really can't help with that bit of education. But I will say that there is a chronology that if you're not aware of, This all started back in 1966. Australia was one of the first countries to have any statement about human experimentation and ethical issues. It then evolved into a full-scale national statement in '99. There was a 2007 version, which underwent a number of changes over the course of a number of years until we finally published a new version in 2023, and now another new version in 2025. You'll see that what the work that was done, the parts of the national statement that have been revised at various times. These slides, by the way, will be available afterwards. I'm not sure how that's being done, but you'll be able to refer to this information that I'm not discussing when you get access to that. Okay, so Section 4 was the heart of the work that was done on the 2025 National Statement, although very importantly, there were significant changes made to other sections as well, either because they needed to be made consistent with Section 4, or because things were brought to our attention that we addressed along the way. And as part of the consultation on Section 4, which occurred in 2023, we actually did two versions of consultation, one in 2020 and one in 2023. We also lost my train of thought. We also made some changes to other sections, which I'll bring to your attention. Okay. The major thematic changes that we introduced were the framing of a change in the way we framed the entire section. Some of you will refer probably to it traditionally as the vulnerable population section. It's actually never used that terminology. That terminology's never been used in the national statement, but certainly vulnerability was at the heart of what it was about. Those of you who followed the whole trajectory of these changes will know that we tried to introduce in 2020 an extensive discussion of what vulnerability meant and a reshaping of the whole section. There was not the support for it from the sector, from stakeholders, was weak. They felt that it was not well done and that we should go back to a more traditional structure of listing groups of people. And then we considered whether that should be, how we should present that. And the decision was that it would be presented in terms of increased harm rather than in terms of vulnerability, because if you ask yourself what it is you're vulnerable to, the answer is increased risk of harm. And so we went with that instead, and it seems to have worked quite well. There's an stronger emphasis on the inclusion of groups and individuals that are traditionally excluded or underrepresented in research. So there's a shift from a sort of protective attitude towards a need to include. So the default is, no, don't explain to us why you're including people, explain to us why you're not including people who are arguably eligible for inclusion. Of course, there are eligibility criteria for individual research projects that override that broad sense of inclusion, but philosophically speaking, there's a movement to that. We wanted to draw a distinction between research involving people who are at increased risk due to characteristics or circumstances, individual or collective, and the increased risk generated by the research context themselves. And an example would be, as you'll see, the new chapter on crises and disasters and all that, where the risk comes from the context of the research itself. Everybody in that instance is at increased risk of harm, but the increased risk of harm is a function of the event or the context for the research. Importantly, in 2018, we made a change to the national statement such that certain kinds of research that had previously been mandated for review by NHRC no longer necessarily needed to be reviewed in that way. And that was clinical trials and complex genetic research, acknowledging that the vast majority of research of those sorts would be reviewed by NHRC, but some could be considered low risk. So we removed that. Almost nobody noticed. So we made a stronger statement in 2023 that, for example, low-risk research, including some clinical trials, to make it really hard to not understand that that might be possible. We then applied that concept of the lack of automatic, or the change from an automatic requirement for review by an HREC for groups listed in Section 4. We removed that requirement. That is, that all research now needs to be considered on a case-by-case basis to determine whether the appropriate review pathway is the HREC or a low-risk review process. And that applies to everything and everybody, acknowledging, again, that the vast majority of research of certain types involving certain groups of people is, of course, going to be reviewed by an HREC as greater than low risk. But the involvement of those people in and of itself does not constitute additional risk, pushing it into the greater than low risk category. That was presented in 2023. You may have had, well, sorry, that's being presented in the 2025 version. So that is a major change. There's also a recognition of certain issues related to the guidance on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research that needed to be strengthened, and in particular, a mandatory requirement to consult documents outside of the national statement that have much more detailed guidance. That is the AATSIS Code of Ethics and NHMRC's own Indigenous Research Ethics Guidelines. Here's a table of the revised guidance and what was revised. There's similarly a document on the website that in the facts section that lists this, and now a document that also lists more minor changes and where they've appeared. So again, I mentioned other sections of the national statement that have undergone some change. Those are listed here. We'll be probably talking about some of that in the question and answer section. Implementation of these changes. It is as written here. However, I need to share with you that there's a strong likelihood that we are going to have to delay the implementation, the effective date of the national statement, as a consequence of some issues that we've run into with the human research ethics application. That will be made public, that information, to all the HRECs very, very soon. And you will be given notice of what we're planning. I'm not at liberty to be any more specific than that. So as I mentioned, we have on the website, when you go onto the national website to look for the national statement, there's a national statement sort of introductory page, which talks about the history and lists the summary of the various updates that have been made, and lists links to the 2023 and 2025 versions. Keep in mind that the 2023 version is still the current version, although many of you may have moved to implementing part or all of 2025. As a technical matter, the 2023 version is still the current version until the 2025 version effective date. We've also there's a list of summary of changes to the national statement. As I've been saying to people, it's unlikely there will be any further review of the national statement, broadly speaking, over the next few years, so that we can devote our resources to some other things. And because we've now reviewed over a 9-year period of continuous review, we reviewed almost the entire document. In fact, every chapter has undergone change except for 2.2, consent, at one point or another during this process. But we are exploring some alternative ways to address the need for additional guidance and interpretation of the guidance that's been presented. And we're working on that as an active thing, and that information will be available when it's ready to be. Now, before I go to the next slide, I'm going to make a comment. As you are aware, the oversight of the national statement is under the Australian Health Ethics Committee, or AHEC. AHEC meets 3 times a year, and there are working groups that work on various issues. I'm responsible to that committee, as are some others. That committee is meeting next week on Tuesday. At that meeting, several issues that we're considering how we're going to address are being discussed. But because they haven't been discussed yet, and the Australian Health Ethics Committee has not made some decisions about which issues are going to be prioritized and how they're going to be addressed and when, I am not at liberty at this event to discuss those issues with you. And that means that I'm going to have to be somewhat vague in the discussions and in the responses to your answers, to your questions about certain issues. It's not because we're being, deceptive or vague on purpose, or that we don't know what we're talking about, or that we're just being typical, I'm being a typical government bureaucrat or something like that. It's because there's an actual reason why I can't discuss certain things in as much detail as I might like. That's the introduction to the next slide, which is the challenges that we're facing with implementation. And these are issues that have been raised since the release of the 2025 National Statement, although they may well have been raised earlier as well. Some of you write into us, and we, with queries, we get hundreds of these a year. And over the past few years, and in particular this year, a number of issues have been raised. Some of these issues, some of the people on this line have already seen your names, have written in specifically about certain issues, one in particular. These issues, we are aware of your concerns. They are real concerns. We will be addressing those concerns, and you will know exactly how quite soon. So I'm being a little bit oblique about how I'm presenting this on purpose. There's some questions about the hierarchy or the scope of criteria for different levels of review. There is a hierarchy here, starting from no ethics review being required at all, to the possibility, the eligibility for exemption from ethics review, which is an institutional decision, right? And that is different from, for example, asking for a waiver. It's either, if it's exempt, it doesn't need a waiver, for example. And that often gets confused. Then there's the low risk review processes, which may or may not include a waiver request. And as you know, how to manage waiver, components to research is problematic given the constraints the national statement places on this, which are themselves required because of privacy requirements, not because we sought to impose ethics requirements here. And then, of course, higher risk research, which requires HREC review. It's important to keep in mind this hierarchy, and that all of these things may be appropriate in one of these may be appropriate in a given situation. Seems to be some confusion about the relationship between the need for requesting a waiver of the requirement for consent for lower risk research and eligibility for exemption from ethics review. These are not the same thing. They are separate, and there's a decision needs to be made as to whether it is eligible for exemption from ethics review, or it's lower risk research and a waiver is appropriate. Those are two separate issues and two separate decisions. Characteristics of data information in the relationship to the need for ethics review and the application of privacy guidelines. This is a constant issue. It's been made even more of an issue in recent times, and there's some new stuff in the national statement that has created some concerns, and those are the things I can't talk about. We've introduced the concept of assent, which creates yet another hierarchy from consent to assent to agreement to participate. And there's some very nuanced language about this in the national statement, and it's on purpose. So read these sections very carefully. There are instances in which consent is not possible, but agreement to participate or to continue participation may be possible. In the national statement, consent refers only to that technical or formal process that occurs at the beginning of a research project. You cannot provide consent to a project in which you're already participating. You can only agree to continue participating according to the national statement. Assent is, of course, a term that is used colloquially and technically to refer to a level of agreement that requires a certain amount of information to be provided, and yet it is not valid consent, either for ethical or, more appropriately, legal reasons, usually having to do with capacity to consent related to age, or this also applies for people experiencing physical or mental ill health or disability. So that's a lot to take in, but this is all set out, we hope, fairly clearly in chapter 4.3 and in chapter 4.5. Certain issues that have come we consistently get in queries about have to do with issues that were actually introduced, things that were actually introduced 2 years ago in 2023 that people seem to think have been introduced in 2025. That's not correct. And one of them is all sorts of guidance around how risk should be assessed, the fact that assessment of risk is separate from review decisions, review pathway decisions, monitoring responsibilities. What are the roles of the various elements of the actors, researchers, institutions, and review bodies in assessment of risk, and the decision about review pathways and monitoring responsibilities. The concept of low-risk clinical trials, again, this was introduced in 2023. A last issue that I throw in there because it's one of my favorites has to do with the concept of a quorum for valid HREC decisions. I'm not going to go into that right now, but just so you know, there is no concept of quorum in the national statement. You can introduce one if you like, but it doesn't exist there. What matters in the national statement is, are all of the minimum members participating in a decision about whether to approve a research project or not? Not all of the categories, but all of the members. So it's not 6, it's 8. There are 6 categories in minimum membership, but there are 8 people. All 8 need to be involved, not all 6. But that's not a quorum. A quorum is whatever you decide you want it to be. I'll stop there because Sonia has to have some time, and we want to allow a lot of time for questions. Thanks very much.
Excuse me while I, have some technical things. Thank you so much for the introduction. But of course,
Now I'm trying
you would
to
think that I've got this down pat by now.
I'm trying to stop sharing. Has mine stopped?
Yes, Jeremy, I did it.
Good, thank you.
Sonia, we can see your note slides.
Yeah, I'm just going to flip. How's that? Is that better?
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And, when I reflect on what brings me really here today, I have to come back to and certainly acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which I come to you today from, and particularly honouring the enduring culture, language, and knowledge of the systems that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people bring, and certainly their wealth of sharing and learning when it comes to research that has gone on for tens of thousands of years before us. And fundamentally, as we gather to place participants at the very core, I just realised I've got my camera. Yep. As we gather to place participants at the very core of our decision making, in terms of protecting their rights and welfare, and particularly even more so their right to self-determination, we commit to listen, learning, and walking alongside Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I certainly would encourage and facilitate this extension to culturally and linguistically diverse populations, as well as other, vulnerable populations. So in doing so, and as I begin this particular presentation, I want to make it quite clear that I am no expert. Sure, I've been in the regulatory business for quite some time, but there's several things that have over the years stood out to me very clearly and almost daily, to be perfectly honest. There is more than one way to peel an orange. I learn this every day, not literally peeling the orange, but the fact that we go through multiple ways, multiple viewpoints, multiple processes, all to achieve the same outcome. In other words, appealed orange, or in our case, the protection of the rights and well-being of our research participants and high quality research outcomes that our community expects and certainly, most certainly deserve. So when I reflect back on what Jeremy has highlighted and look, I'm going to take you down a very pragmatic kind of practical view of the 2025 version of the national statement. The changes to Section 4 really have been made in response to input from stakeholders, as Jeremy has highlighted, providing a due public consultation and as part of further targeted consultation to kind of make sure that we're really hearing the voices. They reflect the strong trends in the research sector towards inclusion of participants who are or may be at increased risk of harm, sometimes referred to as our vulnerable populations, and towards really a more nuanced assessment of increased risk based on people's characteristics, circumstances, and the context of the research itself. So when I look at the changes to the 2025 version of the national statement, a great deal has changed, in particular Section 4. As Jeremy pointed out, there are other areas alongside those changes with subtle formatting, grammar, clarity throughout the remainder of the national statement. But I really want to focus our discussion and certainly my pragmatic approach to Chapter 4 in particular. As we can see, there is now extended guidance on children, young people, people with physical, mental ill health and disability, revised guidance on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities, and with great thanks to COVID, setting the scene, a new chapter on how to deal with or how to respond to research endeavours stemming from natural disasters, public health emergencies or other crises. And one thing that I do reflect on is that COVID certainly did teach us a lot of things. And it did open our eyes to new ways of doing. And I regret to say that I'm starting to see a loss of that knowledge, which is such a shame because so many great things happened and really should be promoted as opposed to going, oh, that's just what we do when there's an emergency. But that's a topic for another day. Okay, so really the biggest change is really going to pinpoint how we review research. So when determining the review pathway, the first consideration should really centre around risk. Are we talking about a retrospective chart audit for a research higher degree or a phase 1 clinical trial? Risk profile in those two situations is very different. Once the risk has been assessed in terms of risk to the participant, then we would have previously looked at the participant groups involved in the study to determine which review pathway it would have gone down. So Section 4 relates specifically to ethical considerations specific to participants in research and previously highlighted and focused on the vulnerability of these participant populations and additional considerations that needed to be factored into research design. In essence, this meant that in the past, a retrospective chart review, or what would otherwise qualify as low-risk study, automatically had to be reviewed by the HREC because it involved a specific vulnerable population. So think back to studies involving children or people with a mental illness or women or people who are pregnant. They automatically had to go to the HREC for review. Well, good news, no longer. However, and I quote from the national statement, the inclusion or exclusion of individuals in research who may experience increased risk of harm from participating in the research project raises ethical issues about self-determination and agency, fairness and equitable distribution of benefits, risks and burdens. The national statement now recognises that individuals who identify or who are identified as members of these groups will not necessarily experience the increased risk that is attributed to them by others. The national statement now pivots to recognising the intrinsic value, array, and contributions to healthcare outcomes that these populations can bring, and how now that the risk level will be determined based on what research design is as opposed to what the participant population is. Having said that, if it is likely that a cohort of potential participants who have characteristics that are likely to expose them to an increased risk of harm, such as children who may not be able to have the mental capacity, who may not pass that GILIX competency to provide consent, the research protocol should include strategies to minimise, mitigate and manage these additional risks. Speaking of children, research involving children and young people raises particularly ethical concerns about their capacity to understand the nature of research and the implications of participation. The level of maturity and consequent ability to make decisions regarding participation in research, their potentially conflicting values and interests of children, young people and their parents or guardians, and the possible exploitation or coercion by parents, peers, researchers and others. Consent, as we heard, is both an ethical and legal requirement for children and young people to participate in research. Although children and young people usually lack the maturity to provide valid and legal consent to participate, they benefit from knowing what will happen in the research and having an opportunity to express their interest, their questions, their concerns, and most importantly, their agreement or their assent to participate. So the introduction of the word assent is an ethically relevant term that is used now in the national statement to refer to the process of informing and in seeking an agreement from children or young people to participate in research when it is not possible to obtain valid and legal consent. Incorporating assent into the recruitment of children or young people for research demonstrates the very fundamental principle of respect for persons. In obtaining assent, the emphasis is on respect and communication and engagement with the children or the young person who is the potential research participant. When looking at designing an assent form in particular, really forget about what you knew and go back to your inner child. Include pictures and diagrams in the PICF. Please make sure that the reading age of the information is set at the age of the participants that research is expecting to recruit, so that you enable understanding by the child. For example, an assent form will look very different for a 14 to 17-year-old child as opposed to an 8 to 12-year-old. Be creative. Pictures, videos, diagrams, anything. Engage your inner child, as I said. Better yet, actually, ask the researchers to engage in a child, or a child that can help them design an assent form. What would an 8-year-old child expect to see? What do they want to know when potentially participating in a research project? Also, remembering that assent, just like consent or the agreement to continue, is not really a singular event. Every interaction, the research team must remember to continue to obtain, continue to assent, or that confirmation that they're willing to continue to participate in any study-related procedures. Okay, next we move on to chapter 4.5. In the past, the design, review and conduct of research has directly or indirectly caused people experiencing physical or mental ill health or disability to be disempowered or excluded from research due to assumptions about their ability to make decisions or provide consent, or due to misunderstandings of their ability to participate in research. Now, look, I could take you through all the theory in the world, but I'm going to actually scrap that and go to a very practical example. Probably 2 or 3 months ago, we had a study, and I'm going to be careful not to disclose the who, what, when, where, why, how, but we had a study that was looking at a significant data linkage project of a participant population that involved mental health and alcohol and drug use. And the data linkage was very broad and sought to, in essence, capture data from all sorts of records, from public, private, NGO, QPS, which is the Queensland Police Service, the justice system, really, really broad. data linkage study. We had very two opposing and polarizing views on the committee. One group of HREC members said, oh, no way, you cannot be digging that deep and connecting all of that data. There's very, very, very sensitive information, including obviously legal proceedings and, discovery of illegal practices. And on the other end of the spectrum, we had a group of HREC members who were very much of an epidemiology type mindset and going, oh, perfect, because this study, the whole aim of the study was to really try and identify what the gaps are in the system and how researchers can then inform clinicians to potentially redesign policy and redesign opportunities for supporting this particular patient population. Lo and behold, and unbeknownst to any of us, one of our HREC members self-disclosed that they potentially have in the past represented this patient population or this participant population. And they actually said, yes, I want this data to be reviewed because I want services for that particular area to be improved. And that basically took the wind out of all of the polarizing views, and it really firmly planted that right for self-determination to be landed solely and squarely with the participant. Needless to say, that study was approved. It had a bit of tweaking to do, but it was approved. So there really is an ethical imperative to include people with physical or mental ill health or disability in research and to facilitate the independent decision-making. This includes considering ways to enable people with different physical or mental abilities to provide consent. The assumption should always be that adults are able to provide consent for themselves unless an assessment of their individual ability or the context of the research indicates otherwise. All too often, exclusion criteria automatically includes a generic statement along the lines of patients who are unable to provide consent. But there is usually nowhere in the protocol that indicates there will be an attempt to obtain consent if possible. So this goes back to the assumptions and misunderstandings that have previously been based on this group of people who have a physical mental ill health or disability. We really need to make sure that the design of the project and the assessment of the research takes into account the range of relevant factors, and it shouldn't necessarily be just about whether or not they have this disability or ill health, but more about what the actual study involves. Another a factor to think about, and again, I'm coming back to that practical interpretation of the national statement. When we reflect on the integration and certainly the push of the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, here is a thought bubble. Something to think about particularly in the ICU and emergency setting. In future support of integrating research into everyday practice, the national statement now really advocates that during advanced care planning, expressed wishes for participation in research, whether it be specific or future-based, should also be included. So take that clinical trials governance framework of integrating research into core health service delivery. And during that advanced care planning conversation, all it would take is a very simple 2-minute conversation that really allowed, or during that consultation, for the person to consider whether or not they'd like to participate in research in the future. Giving patients the opportunity to participate, just like giving them the opportunity to inform their future healthcare, really demonstrates that inclusivity and respect. Oops, I am so sorry. What have I done here? Come back. Oh my gosh, I really have dropped the ball. Okay. I'll actually probably will move on because I'm just conscious of the time. Okay, next is chapter 4.7. Very recently, I attended a workshop on Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous intellectual and cultural property. And it really brought home to me in particular about the intrinsic value and the right for self-determination and really the right to guide. I noticed that one of the questions on the Q&As particularly talked about, what happens when we have studies that involve the collection of indigeneity. And my response to that, if you are going to include data on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, before you start to analyse, and well and truly before you even think about publication, you need to engage the community. You need to engage the community to ensure that the way that data is being interpreted and certainly written up in publication is appropriate and culturally respectful. One of the things that we do here at Metro South is we want to see that cultural engagement. There is, in my humble opinion, or perhaps not so humble opinion, we want to see that the community groups that you are seeking to engage are informed, are advised, are part of the research design, are actually informing the research design, and there is element of reciprocity and contributions made back to their community in terms of the engagement provided. We are in the process of actually developing a community jury. So Metro South does see quite a few, does oversee or include quite a few different communities. And another very practical example was we had a Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander research group that had representatives from that community, but from a very different catchment area, who presented a study to us looking to engage the Quandamooka country. So for those of you who aren't familiar, that's the Stradbroke Island, Redland Bay, Redlands area. And during the course, they had, provided all sorts of levels of approval, except they didn't have engagement from the Quandamooka elders, nor the community in which this study was going to be conducted. And unfortunately, the study could not proceed until that engagement happened. So it absolutely is essential that aligning and very much highlighting within a protocol the 6 core values of spirit and integrity, cultural continuity, equity, reciprocity, in particular respect, and responsibility for how data of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is not only analysed but then reported on as well. And then, of course, last but not least is the very new chapter on natural disasters, public health emergencies and other crises. And like I said before, there certainly were a lot of lessons learned during our COVID crisis, some of which are reflected within this new chapter for consideration, but coming at it again from a practical, pragmatic approach, some of those lessons have been lost and we've unfortunately fallen into our old ways. So I would actually highly encourage this community, just as a little bit of a, an opportunity for transformation, is to actually look at those processes that were enabled during that time and actually bring them back to the fore, because we really do want to enable health and medical research inputs. So now what? Where do we go from here? Well, as we just heard from Jeremy, the changes aren't becoming necessarily mandatory from the 1st of October. I must admit, I certainly am encouraging the Metro South research community to incorporate those changes and to think about them moving forward. And, any organisation absolutely can implement these changes prior, so long as there's appropriate engagement with the research community. Just to be totally upfront and really fundamentally, research should be conducted with the 4 core principles of research, merit, integrity, justice, beneficence, and respect at the absolute heart of what we do. Place them front and centre and place participants front and center and as an equal partner. Again, being slightly provocative, I would actually place them as the bus driver and the rest of us as consultants, SMEs and advisors as the backseat driver. But place your participants at the very heart of what you do. If you can afford them respect and the right to have a say and the right to be engaged and be a part of their research journey, you certainly are on a winning track. And that's where I'll end it for now. Stop sharing.
Thank you both so much for your talks today. What we're going to do now is just go through a couple of the Q&A questions. So if there are any other questions that you guys have, please type them into the Q&A and we'll try and address them in the 10 minutes that we have left now. So Jeremy has been very diligent in the last 15 minutes going through and trying to answer online. Just for everyone's knowledge, we will share the slides and the recording within the next 2 to 3 days and try and get them out to everybody. So, Jeremy, I'm going to hand back to you because I noticed there was a couple of questions that you were going to address here in the Q&A part. You're on mute.
Yeah,
There we go.
I'm going to start by making a couple of comments that address a couple of different queries that have come in, including some comments that have been made in the chat. All of the ethics guidance in the national statement is subject to legal factors, legal requirements. And it says this at a number of places in the national statement, not just one, but a number of different places. So for those of you who are saying, how does this line up with legislation? The answer may be that it may be ethically permissible, but legally not available as an option. And that's determinative. That's just the way it goes. The ethics and the legal requirements are closely related, particularly as they relate to people lacking capacity and children, but they are not the same. And a really good example of this is the consent issue. Consent is seems to be very clear, but it's actually very vexed. And it's vexed for two reasons. One is consent is used by some people to mean a very formal process and others to mean agreement as a synonym. And this creates problems in the way we talk about it. The other is that there are legal requirements for consent or for valid consent, and there are ethical requirements, and they aren't the same. And so we need to wrestle with this. Angela Watt has a long question that I haven't been able to absorb yet. Angela is as wordy as I tend to be, and I can't absorb it all. But I think that the overall answer would be that if it's not permissible within a jurisdiction for legal purposes, then it isn't. I mean, the fact that it may be consistent with the national statement doesn't answer the entire question. So, for example, if New South Wales and Queensland rule out participation in emergency life-saving research of people without capacity, then that's the case. That is your restriction, whether or not the national statement permits it. And so I don't know whether that answers the question satisfactorily, but there's a lot in there, Angela, and maybe we can deal with it offline. The other thing to say is that people, and this is not, I'm taking off my NHMRC hat that I'm not wearing now, and I'm putting it down, and I'm speaking to you as an individual. And as an individual, I'd say that it is extremely frustrating for me personally that people seem to be adding more and more and more to the table from which that the HRECs have to deal with, the group of issues that HRECs need to deal with. HRECs are intended to review research, full stop, no qualification. They were not designed to review quality or innovation or infrastructure or any of these other things that they often are doing. Now, that doesn't mean they can't. It means that wasn't the model that originally, remember, HRECs began to review medical research and scientific experimentation. And the scope has been broadened and broadened and broadened such that it is now seems to apply to all sorts of things outside the scope of what an HREC is intended to do. And one of the reasons why they're asked to do this is because institutions have not invested sufficient thought and resources in developing other mechanisms for oversight of things that aren't research. And so these things get sent to the HREC when arguably they should be reviewed elsewhere. And that is, or overseen or scrutinized elsewhere. And that's a broader issue without reference to the specific things that were raised. There was one issue, one question that I deferred to live answers, and that has to do with, I can't see it now. Maybe it's because I said it would be better to do. Let me find this issue. Yes. I think I'll say here, this is one of those places where I am not able to speak with sufficient detail because it is a current issue that we're working on. There are some questions about whether all of the guidance in the national statement lines up and is consistent, and whether certain choices that we've made have resolved issues or actually potentially made them worse. And we are addressing this. It is front and center on our work plan at the moment. You will know when we are going to have a solution for how we're going to deal with this. I can't go any further than that, but in a few weeks, I may be able to discuss it a bit more openly with whoever it is that's asking this as an anonymous attendee. There's another question here. It looks like a new one. Getting a lot of random non-health related stuff coming through. What are the most significant changes? I think there you're going to have to actually consult the text, but the main thing we're trying to do there is to, and I'll use the word force, researchers and reviewers to consult the much more detailed and much more appropriate guidance that's out there on this issue in the form of the ATSIS Code of Ethics and our own Indigenous Research Ethics Guidelines. The national statement you can think of as a kind of broad or general introduction to dealing with these issues, and you should go and consult the other questions, and they're the ones that achieve the things that this query is asking. And Sonia,
certainly, Jeremy, I can add to that. In the past, we have had a representation from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community on our HREC. And that was the lens in which studies that involved Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples was reviewed to that sort of, from a review perspective, have that input now. And as a result, particularly of this change in Chapter 4, we don't just rely on having a HREC member who identifies as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person and have their viewpoint. We actually mandate that there is evidence of appropriate community engagement in the design as part of the team, and that there is a plan for that reciprocity and respect and a handing back of the data sovereignty back to the community in which participated in the research project. So that's probably the practical interpretation that certainly we apply in enabling Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's research within our communities.
Fantastic. It looks like we've reached the end of the questions that have trickled through there. So we might draw this session to a close. I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to our two speakers, Jeremy Kenner and Sonia Hancock, for their time today and for their fantastic presentation. I hope everyone here found it as interesting and worthwhile as I did. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question. Our Community of Practice Teams group is the best way to connect with us and each other, and you can start a post to ask a question or share resources. If you would like to join the community, or if you aren't on our mailing list already, please subscribe using the link that I'm putting in the chat now. If you'd like to get in touch with our leadership group, please contact either Sarah or Sophie at any time. Their emails are also in the chat. Our next event will be on the 24th of November as part of the National HREC Conference, and more information is to come about that in our next newsletter, so stay tuned. Once again, thank you to our speakers and for everyone joining us today for the session.